Please, if only for a few minutes, pretend to be my son. That was the fragile, trembling request that seemed almost impossible to make sense of. While most people would have lowered their eyes and kept walking to avoid getting involved, Daniel Hartwell chose to stop and listen to what could possibly lead a successful businessman, a man used to measuring everything in numbers and results, to agree to such an unexpected favor. This is not just the story of a man and a stranger he met on a park bench. It's a story that reminds us that as the years pass, what the heart needs most isn't money. It's someone willing to stay when the rest of the world seems to have walked away. Personally, I think all of us should ask ourselves if we've ever walked past someone who only needed a few minutes of our attention. And before we go any further, I want to wish you health and peace. Tell me, where are you watching this from and what time is it there right now? Portland woke up under a heavy grey sky that October morning, the kind of sky the Pacific Northwest wears like a second skin once autumn settles in. A cold mist drifted along the park blocks, and maple leaves the color of rust and gold covered the sidewalks in a thick, wet carpet. Coffee shops on every corner filled the air with the smell of dark roast and cinnamon, and joggers in rain shells moved past food carts just opening their windows. For most people in the city, it was an ordinary Tuesday. For Daniel Hartwell, though he had no way of knowing it yet, it would become the day his entire life quietly turned a corner. At 52, Daniel ran one of the most successful real estate development firms in the Pacific Northwest. Hartwell Realty Group had his name on office towers, waterfront condos, and mixed-use developments stretching from the Pearl District to the hills above the Willamette. He had built all of it through discipline, long hours, and a refusal to ever really stop moving. His employees respected him. Investors trusted him without hesitation. But when the meetings ended and the office lights went out one by one, the silence always found him again. Ever since he lost his wife, Claire, and the daughter they never got to hold, work had become the only place he could hide from the memories that waited for him at home. There was another kind of silence Daniel had carried for even longer, one he almost never spoke about. He had been adopted as an infant by Robert and Susan Hartwell, a schoolteacher and a machinist from Eugene who had wanted children for years before a caseworker finally placed a 3-day-old baby boy in Susan's arms. They had raised him with a steady, unremarkable kind of love, the sort that didn't need grand gestures to be real, and Daniel had never wanted for anything growing up. His parents told him the truth about his adoption when he turned 16, in the same plain, matter-of-fact tone they used for everything else, and beyond that single conversation, the subject rarely came up again. Robert passed away from a stroke when Daniel was 31. Susan followed 6 years later, quietly in her sleep. By the time he was 40, both of the only parents he had ever known were gone, and whatever curiosity he might once have had about the woman who gave birth to him had long since been buried under deadlines, acquisitions, and the steady architecture of a life built to outrun questions rather than answer them. That afternoon, instead of calling his driver, Daniel decided to walk. He needed to get away from the hum of the office, to feel the cold air on his face and clear the fog that had settled behind his eyes. Without any real destination, he cut through side streets he rarely bothered with anymore, past small family-owned bakeries and second-hand bookstores that had somehow survived decades of change, until he found himself in a quiet residential pocket of the city he hadn't visited in years. That was when he noticed it. A modest brick building tucked behind a wrought-iron fence, with a small garden out front, wooden benches, and rose bushes someone clearly still cared for. A sign near the entrance read, "Willowbrook Senior Living." A few residents sat outside despite the chill, wrapped in blankets, talking quietly or simply watching the wind move through the branches. There was a stillness to the place that felt almost foreign compared to the churn of downtown. Daniel slowed his pace, more out of curiosity than anything else. "Excuse me, are you Daniel Hartwell?" He turned, startled. An elderly woman was trying to rise from one of the benches, her hand braced against the armrest. She wore a worn wool coat, faded at the cuffs but clean and carefully buttoned. The kind of coat someone takes real pride in keeping presentable no matter how old it gets. Her hands trembled slightly as she steadied herself, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet, stubborn dignity that made it impossible for Daniel to just nod politely and keep walking. "Yes, that's me," he said. She took a slow breath, as if she'd been rehearsing this moment for longer than he could guess. "My name is Eleanor Doyle. I know this might sound strange, but I've been waiting for you since this morning." Daniel's brow creased. "I think you might have the wrong person." "No, sir. I asked about you a few days ago. Someone told me you sometimes walk through this part of town after work. I was only hoping I'd be lucky enough to run into you." There was something about the plainness of her voice, the total absence of performance in it, that kept his feet planted on the sidewalk. "What is it you need?" he asked. Eleanor lowered her eyes for a moment. "I only need you to pretend to be my son. Just for a minute." Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" "Just 1 minute, that's all I'm asking. After that you can go, and I promise I won't bother you again." There was no confusion on the old woman's face, no sign that her mind was slipping. Only a deep, aching sadness. "Why would you ask something like that?" Daniel said. Eleanor finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "Because if they think I'm completely alone in this world, they're going to separate me from my brother for good." That single sentence stopped Daniel from glancing at his watch. "His name is Walter," she said. "He's 81. He has Alzheimer's. Some days he doesn't know where he is, doesn't know what year it is, doesn't recognize the nurses who've cared for him for months, but he still knows my voice. When he hears me, he calms down. If they move him away from me, he's going to lose the last face his memory still holds on to." Eleanor turned toward one of the upper windows of the building. "They say it's for his own good. Maybe it is, but I know we'll never live under the same roof again if this happens." Daniel stood there in silence. He didn't know this woman, and yet something in the way she spoke told him the pain behind her words was completely real. "Why me, though?" he asked. "You could have stopped anyone walking by. Why go through the trouble of finding out my name, my schedule, the streets I might happen to walk down?" Eleanor considered the question for a moment, as though she'd expected it, and still hadn't quite settled on an answer she was ready to give. "Because I needed someone who wouldn't just say a kind word and keep walking. I needed someone who might actually understand what it costs to be responsible for another person. I read that you built your whole company from nothing after your family passed. I thought, maybe a man like that knows something about not wanting to let people down." "You don't know anything about me," Daniel said, though the words came out softer than he intended. "No," Eleanor admitted. "I don't. I only know what the newspapers print, and newspapers don't tell you who a person really is. But I'm out of better options, Mr. Hartwell. I've asked lawyers I can't afford. I've written letters to the county that nobody answered, and I've prayed more in the last 2 months than I have in the last 20 years combined. You were the last name on a very short list. Don't you have any other family who could help?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I never had children of my own, not that I raised anyway. When our parents passed, I promised Walter I would look after him for as long as we both lived. I've kept that promise for over 50 years. I'm not ready to break it now." At that exact moment, a voice rang out from somewhere inside the building, thin and panicked. "Eleanor! Eleanor, where are you?" The old woman closed her eyes for a beat. "That's Walter." Daniel looked up toward the window. He couldn't make out a face, only the desperation carried in that voice, echoing down the hallway and out through the glass. After a few seconds of silence, he made his decision. "All right," he said, "I'll come in with you." For the first time since she'd approached him, something like hope flickered across Eleanor's face. The two of them walked toward the entrance together, neither one of them imagining just how much that small, strange decision was about to change both their lives. The lobby of Willowbrook was wrapped in a strange kind of hush, the sort of quiet that only exists in places built around waiting. Somewhere a television murmured with the volume too low to make out words, an old grandfather clock ticked steadily by the front desk, and a medication cart squeaked softly as an aide wheeled it down the hall. Daniel walked beside Eleanor without speaking, aware with every step that he could no longer treat this afternoon like some passing curiosity. He had crossed a line the moment he agreed to walk through that door. A woman in her late 40s appeared behind the reception desk, her uniform crisp, her smile the kind that had clearly been perfected over years of professional practice. "Good afternoon, Eleanor," she said warmly, before her eyes shifted to Daniel with visible surprise. "I wasn't told you had a visitor scheduled." "This is my son," Eleanor said, the words coming out with only the faintest hesitation. The woman studied them both for a moment, before stepping around the desk and extending her hand. "Diane Foster, director here at Willowbrook. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Hartwell." Her smile didn't waver. "Your mother's mentioned you before, though I have to admit I never expected the pleasure of an actual visit." Daniel understood immediately that this moment would decide whether the lie held or collapsed. "Work's kept me tied up more than it should have," he said evenly. "I finally managed to carve out some time today." "I completely understand," Diane replied. "Life has a way of making us put off the things that matter most." The sentence was delivered kindly enough, but Eleanor lowered her gaze with a flicker of quiet resignation that told Daniel this wasn't the first time she'd heard some version of that line. Before anyone could say more, the anxious voice returned, closer now, drifting down the corridor. "Eleanor, where did she go?" The old woman's head snapped up instantly. "That's Walter." Without waiting for a response, she started moving as fast as her legs would carry her. Daniel followed. In the common room, a thin man with a full head of silver hair sat near a window, gripping an old plaid scarf so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The moment he spotted Eleanor, his whole body seemed to unclench. "I thought you left," Walter said, his voice cracking. Eleanor crossed the room and took both his hands in hers. "I would never leave without saying goodbye to you." Walter exhaled like a man who had just remembered how to breathe. Then his gaze landed on Daniel. "Who's that?" Eleanor hesitated for the briefest instant. "He's family." Walter's face broke into an open, unguarded smile, the kind children give strangers before they learn to be careful. "Then, can he sit with us?" Daniel accepted without a word. For several minutes he simply sat and watched the two of them together. Eleanor spoke slowly, drifting through small memories from their childhood. Summers on a lake somewhere in Ohio, a dog named Buster, a bicycle they'd shared until the wheels fell off. Walter lost the thread here and there, mixed up a date or a name, but every time Eleanor's voice reached him, the anxiety drained visibly out of his shoulders. A single glance from her was enough to settle him completely. The scene struck something deep in Daniel, something he hadn't expected. Meanwhile, Diane lingered near the doorway, watching them. "Eleanor, could I borrow you for a moment?" The old woman gave Walter's shoulder a gentle squeeze before standing. "I'll be right back." Walter nodded obediently, his eyes never leaving her as she disappeared down the hallway. Once they were gone, Daniel stayed seated beside him. Walter kept staring quietly out at the garden. "My sister always keeps her promises," he said softly, almost to himself. "She never lets me be afraid." Daniel swallowed hard. "It's clear how much she loves you." Walter smiled. "She always finds me." Those 4 words lodged themselves somewhere in Daniel's chest and refused to leave. A few minutes later, Eleanor returned with Diane trailing a step behind her. The small flicker of hope that had lit her face earlier had gone out completely, replaced by something heavier. Daniel rose immediately. "Something's happened." Eleanor waited until Diane had walked a few steps away before answering. "Yes." She paused, gathering herself. "I need to ask you for a much bigger favor than I ever imagined I would." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing at all, and when she finally lifted her eyes, they carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent decades carrying a weight alone, never once asking anyone for help. "Diane wants to move Walter into the memory care unit by the end of the week," she said. "They believe he'll get better attention there." Daniel waited, letting her continue. "And you?" he asked. She let out a slow breath. "I'll be kept on a different floor, different schedules, different aides. We might see each other for a few minutes a day, if we're lucky." Every word seemed to cost her something. To anyone looking in from the outside, it probably sounds reasonable. But Walter doesn't understand change anymore, not really. Every time he wakes up and I'm not there, he thinks our parents have died all over again. He relives the same grief again and again, like it's happening for the very first time. Daniel glanced toward the common room, where Walter sat quietly by the window, absently working the scarf between his fingers as he watched the wind move through the garden, seemingly unaware that the conversation deciding his future was happening just down the hall. "Isn't there another option?" Daniel asked. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "The facility doesn't believe I have any family capable of taking on real responsibility for him. Without that kind of support, they think separating us is the safer choice." Just then, Diane reappeared, a folder tucked under her arm. "Mr. Hartwell, would you mind stepping into my office for a moment?" Daniel agreed and followed her inside. She closed the door gently before taking a seat behind her desk. "I don't want you to think we're heartless here," she began. "Our first responsibility is to protect the people in our care. Walter needs specialized supervision around the clock. Eleanor has done an admirable job looking after him for years, but she's 78 years old herself. Every day it gets a little harder for her to take care of even her own needs." Daniel understood the logic behind her words, but something about it still didn't sit right with him. "They don't want to be apart," he said. Diane folded her hands over the folder. "I know, and believe me, no one here enjoys making decisions like this one. But love alone isn't always enough. It takes resources, stability, and someone willing to take on real, long-term responsibility." "How long has Eleanor been caring for him on her own?" Daniel asked. Diane glanced down at the folder without opening it, as if she already knew the number by heart. "Records here only go back 11 years, since they moved in together. But from what she's told our staff over the years, she's been the one looking after Walter his entire adult life, long before either of them ever set foot in this building." "And in 11 years, has anyone else ever come to visit them? Any other family?" Diane was quiet for a moment too long. "Not once. Not until you." That answer sat heavier in Daniel's chest than he expected it to. That sentence followed Daniel out of the office and stayed with him even after he'd left the building. When he made his way back to the garden, he found the two siblings sitting together on the same wooden bench as before. Eleanor was recounting an old memory, something about the two of them running through the streets of a small Midwestern town during a 4th of July parade, chasing sparklers and hiding behind their neighbors' hedges. Walter mixed up a few names and blurred a few details, but every time Eleanor's voice reached him, the smile returned to his face, and for a few minutes, whatever the disease had taken from him seemed to loosen its grip. Daniel watched them from a distance. For the first time in years, he understood that some bonds could withstand even the slow erosion of memory itself. Eleanor glanced up and waved him over. "Thank you for staying," she said. Daniel offered a small, uncertain smile. "I didn't really do much." She shook her head. "Sometimes staying is the most important thing a person can do for someone else." Those words hit him harder than he expected. He thought of the emptiness Claire's death had carved into his life. He thought of the long, sleepless nights when the silence of his own house had become unbearable, and how he'd chosen to bury himself in work instead of facing any of it. For years he'd told himself that moving forward meant never slowing down. Now, for the first time, he wondered if what he'd really been doing all along was running. He looked at Walter again. The old man was smiling at him without any idea who he actually was, and yet he'd accepted him completely, without a single question, with the kind of open, disarming trust most adults forget how to give. Daniel took a breath. "I'll come back tomorrow." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You mean that?" "I do. I want to understand the full situation before anything gets decided. Maybe there's still another way." The old woman's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. She said nothing at first, only reached for her brother's hand and held it tightly while she looked at Daniel with a gratitude too large for words. By the time Daniel left Willowbrook, the sun was already dipping behind the rooftops of the city. Walking toward where he'd parked, one thought kept circling back through his mind. Maybe success had let him build towers and companies and a considerable fortune, but perhaps he still hadn't learned the most important lesson of all, how to stay beside someone who needed him, even after everyone else had already walked away. The next morning Daniel arrived at Willowbrook, well before the day's activities had even started. The garden was still damp with dew, and the cold air forced most of the residents outside to wrap themselves in an extra layer. It was the first time in years he'd rearranged his entire schedule on nothing but his own instinct. He'd cancelled 2 major meetings that morning without a trace of guilt. Inside, he found Eleanor sitting alone near the lobby window. Her face lit up the moment she saw him. "I thought maybe you'd change your mind," she admitted. "I told you I'd be back." She lowered her eyes for a moment. "It's been a long time since anyone kept a promise to me that quickly." They walked together toward the garden, where Walter was already waiting with an aide, staring intently at a small maple tree, his fingers laced together in that same restless, distracted way. The instant he heard Eleanor's voice, his head snapped up and his whole face brightened. "You came back?" "Of course I did," she smiled. "And look, he came back too." Walter's eyes moved to Daniel. Those words made all three of them smile at once. For a while they simply sat together in silence. Walter watched a few sparrows land near a fountain, while Eleanor described each bird as if they were discovering them for the very first time. Daniel took in the scene with a strange mixture of admiration and sorrow, understanding more clearly with every passing minute that what Walter truly needed wasn't only medication. It was that same calm, steady voice that had been with him since childhood. A little later, Diane approached. "Mr. Hartwell, could we talk for a few minutes?" This time they walked to a small office overlooking the garden. Diane opened a folder thick with medical reports. "I don't want to hide anything from you. Walter needs constant supervision. He's had several episodes of disorientation over the last few months, and he depends more and more on the staff every week." Daniel scanned a few of the pages without a word. "And Eleanor is doing everything she possibly can," Diane continued. "More than anyone her age should be expected to do. But she's exhausted. She needs someone looking after her too." Daniel looked up. "Then why not add more support instead of separating them?" Diane was quiet for a moment. "Because we simply don't have the staffing to provide that level of care while keeping them in the same room." The answer sounded more like policy than compassion. When Daniel stepped out of the office, he decided to walk the halls on his own. He passed simple, sparse rooms, quiet corridors, and common areas where some residents dozed in front of muted televisions, while others sat completely alone. One woman clutched a faded photograph in both hands. A man down the hall kept repeating the same question over and over, with no one left to answer him. Those images stayed with Daniel long after he'd moved past them. For the first time, he understood the real difference between simply keeping a body alive and actually staying present for someone's life. Back in the garden, he found Walter growing agitated, glancing nervously in every direction. "Where's Eleanor?" An aide tried to reassure him. "She just went to get some water. She'll be right back." But Walter wasn't listening anymore. His breathing quickened. "No, she's gone. She's gone." Daniel crouched down beside him. "Walter." The old man looked up, eyes wide with panic. "Eleanor always comes back," Daniel said quietly, "and she's about to walk through that door right now." Walter stared at him for a long moment. Slowly, his breathing began to steady. A second later, Eleanor appeared with a glass of water in hand. Relief flooded Walter's face instantly. "I knew you'd come back." Eleanor set the glass down and wrapped her arms gently around her brother. Daniel looked away out of respect, but that single embrace confirmed everything he'd already begun to suspect. Separating them wouldn't just disrupt their routine. It could destroy the one place Walter still felt safe in the world. As he left the building that evening, Daniel made a quiet decision. He was done simply watching from the sidelines. He would find a way to keep these two people from spending whatever years they had left apart from each other. That night, Daniel barely slept. Sitting in front of the wide window of his downtown apartment, he watched the lights of Portland shimmer through the rain and couldn't stop asking himself one question. Why was it impossible to stop thinking about two people he'd only known for 24 hours? For years, he'd made million-dollar decisions with total composure, closed entire building acquisitions in a single meeting, negotiated contracts without ever letting emotion cloud his judgment. And yet here he was, unable to get Eleanor and Walter out of his mind. His chief operating officer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who had worked beside him for nearly a decade, noticed the shift almost immediately. 3 days into his sudden absences, she caught him in the hallway outside his own office. "You missed the Lakeview financing call this morning," she said, not unkindly, but with the directness of someone who'd earned the right to speak plainly to him. "That's the second one this week." I know, Daniel said. Push it to Thursday. Daniel, the investors are starting to ask questions. I've covered for you twice now, and I will again if you need me to, but I'd like to at least understand what's going on. He hesitated, unsure how to explain it in a way that wouldn't sound absurd. There's a woman at a senior living facility on the east side. Her and her brother are about to be separated by the facility's policy, and I've decided I'm not going to let that happen. Priya studied him for a long moment, clearly waiting for the rest of the explanation, the part that would make sense of a man like Daniel Hartwell rearranging his entire calendar for two strangers. When it didn't come, she simply nodded. "Okay," she said, "then I'll keep the fires down here. Just don't disappear on me completely." It was a small exchange, but it mattered to Daniel more than he expected. For the first time in years, someone at the company had looked at him not as the founder whose decisions kept 200 people employed, but simply as a man doing something that mattered to him. He thanked her and meant it more than the words let on. The next morning he arrived at his office before any of his staff. His assistant looked startled to see him cancel yet another round of meetings. "Should I reschedule these for next week, Mr. Hartwell?" "Yes, there's something more important I need to take care of first." She studied him with visible confusion. She'd never heard him say a sentence like that before. A few minutes later, Daniel called Samantha Cole, the attorney who had handled Hartwell Realty's legal affairs for more than 15 years. When she arrived at his office, she found an empty folder sitting on his desk. "So what's the emergency this time?" she asked with a faint smile. Daniel took a slow breath. "I want to know if there's any legal way to stop a nursing home from separating two elderly siblings who live there." Samantha's eyebrows lifted. That wasn't the kind of question she was used to hearing from him. For nearly half an hour, Daniel walked her through everything, from the moment Eleanor approached him outside Willowbrook to his conversation with Diane Foster. Samantha listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, thinking it over. "This won't be simple," she said. Daniel waited. "If the facility can show the move is based on legitimate medical need, they'll have solid legal footing. That doesn't mean the decision can't be challenged, though." "What would we need?" "Full access to the documentation, clinical assessments, the facility's internal policies, everything. We'd also want an independent geriatric specialist to evaluate whether separating them is genuinely in Walter's best interest, medically speaking." Daniel nodded firmly. "Then let's start today." That same afternoon, the two of them drove back to Willowbrook. Diane greeted them with clear surprise. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon, Mr. Hartwell." Daniel made the introduction. "This is Samantha Cole, my attorney." For a brief instant, something shifted in Diane's expression. The warmth was still there, but a new caution had crept in alongside it. "We just want a clearer understanding of the situation," Samantha said politely, "before any final decision is made. We'll also be requesting an outside medical evaluation to explore every possible alternative." Diane agreed to share what documentation policy allowed and walk them through the facility's process. While the two women talked, Daniel stepped out into the garden, where he found Eleanor and Walter sitting beneath the same tree as the day before. Walter was feeding a small handful of breadcrumbs to a group of sparrows, delighted every time one landed close enough to reach. "Look," Walter said, pointing. "That one always comes back." Eleanor smiled. "Because he knows he's safe here." Daniel sat down beside them. For several minutes, none of them said a word. The silence felt surprisingly easy, almost comfortable. Finally, Eleanor broke it. "Have you found anything yet?" "Not yet," Daniel admitted, "but I'm not giving up." She studied him for a long moment. "I still don't understand why you're doing all of this for us." Daniel took his time answering. He wasn't entirely sure himself. He looked over at Walter, still laughing softly as the birds circled the bench, then back at Eleanor. "Maybe because for too long, all I cared about was building companies," he said slowly, "and now I'm starting to understand that people need something worth a lot more than money." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "My mother used to tell me that real wealth was having someone say your name with love once you got old." Daniel looked down. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had simply waited for him just to share a few minutes of conversation. Before they said their goodbyes that afternoon, Walter reached out and took Daniel's hand. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Daniel smiled. I promise. He didn't answer right away this time. Instead, he leaned down to Walter's eye level and shook his hand with a firm, deliberate grip. I promise. As Daniel and Samantha walked back to the car, neither of them spoke for a long stretch of sidewalk. It was Samantha who finally broke the silence. I think this means a lot more to you than you're letting on. Daniel glanced back at the building one last time before getting into the car. He no longer saw a senior living facility. He saw the home of two siblings who only wanted the chance to grow old together, and he had made up his mind that he was going to make that happen, no matter what stood in the way. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel rarely let a single day pass without visiting Willowbrook. His presence stopped surprising the staff entirely. Walter no longer asked who the well-dressed man was who showed up every morning. He simply smiled the moment he saw him. There he is. As the days went by, that small phrase started to mean far more to Daniel than he ever could have expected. One rainy Thursday, he arrived to find Walter having a difficult morning, convinced that the calendar on the wall was wrong, insisting over and over that it should still be 1974. An aide had tried gently correcting him twice, which only made him more agitated. Eleanor hadn't arrived yet. She'd been held up at a doctor's appointment of her own, and Daniel, without quite planning to, pulled a chair up beside Walter instead of waiting in the hallway. "Tell me about 1974, Daniel said. Walter blinked, thrown by the question, then slowly began to relax. That was the year I got my first car, a green Impala. Eleanor hated that car. He laughed, a real laugh, the tension draining out of his shoulders. She said it smelled like a gas station. Did you keep it long? Long enough to teach her to drive in the church parking lot on Sundays. Walter's eyes softened. She was a terrible driver. Still might be, for all I know. By the time Eleanor arrived 20 minutes later, Walter was calm, laughing, entirely present. She stopped in the doorway, watching the two of them with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read at the time, something between gratitude and disbelief. "What did you do?" she asked quietly, once Walter had drifted off for his afternoon nap. "Nothing," Daniel said. "I just asked him about the car." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "You have a gift for this. Most people talk to him like he's already gone. You talk to him like he's still here." On another afternoon, Daniel brought a small chessboard, remembering offhand that Walter had mentioned playing years ago. Walter couldn't hold the rules in his head for more than a few moves at a time, and the games never finished the way a real game should, but he lit up every time he captured one of Daniel's pieces, triumphant as a much younger man. Eleanor sat nearby doing needlepoint, glancing up every so often with a small, private smile she didn't bother to hide. There were harder days too. One afternoon, Daniel arrived to find Walter in tears, certain that Eleanor had abandoned him the way, he insisted, their mother once had. Eleanor knelt in front of his wheelchair, her own knees clearly protesting the movement, and simply held his face in both hands until his breathing slowed. "I'm not her," she whispered. "I'm never going to be her. I'm the one who stayed." Daniel stood in the doorway that day and didn't move for a long time. Something about the phrase of "the one who stayed" followed him home and sat with him long after the lights of the city had gone dark outside his window. Meanwhile, Samantha gathered every medical file she could access, consulted with several outside specialists, and arranged for an independent geriatric evaluation. After reviewing the full record, the specialist's conclusion was clear. While Walter did require specialized care, maintaining his bond with Eleanor was genuinely beneficial to his emotional stability, and there was no legal requirement to separate them as long as the proper resources were in place. When Samantha shared the news, Daniel didn't hesitate for even a second. "I'll cover it, all of it." Samantha looked at him carefully. "This is a real commitment, Daniel. We're not just talking about money. There will be medical decisions, legal responsibilities, ongoing oversight." Daniel smiled with quiet certainty. "I know." It was the first genuinely significant decision he'd made since Claire's death. A few days later, a meeting was arranged with Willowbrook's leadership. Diane listened closely as Daniel laid out the proposal. He would personally fund the additional staffing needed so Walter could receive full specialized care without ever leaving the room he shared with Eleanor. A dedicated nurse would monitor both siblings daily, following the recommendations laid out in the independent report. For a long moment, no one in the room said anything. Finally, Diane closed the folder in front of her. "I have to be honest, we've never had a proposal quite like this one." She looked at Daniel, and the guarded distance from their first meeting had completely disappeared, replaced now by something closer to respect. "With the medical safeguards you're proposing, there's no longer any real reason to separate them." The words seemed to freeze the room in place. Eleanor sat perfectly still. Her lips trembled slightly as she tried to process what she'd just heard. "Does that mean we can stay together?" she asked. Diane smiled, genuine this time. "Yes." Walter looked between everyone in the room, confused. "What's happening?" Eleanor moved to him slowly and took both his hands, the same way she had thousands of times over the course of a lifetime. "We're not being separated." Walter said nothing for a moment. Then he pulled his sister into a fierce, unexpected hug. "I told you," he said. "Told me what?" Eleanor asked, tears already spilling down her face. "That you'd always find me." Neither Daniel nor Samantha could hold back their emotion. Even Diane turned discreetly aside to wipe her eyes before speaking again. That afternoon, the four of them walked slowly through the garden together. The wind moved gently through the branches, while Walter kept his arm looped through his sister's, glancing back every so often to make sure Daniel was still walking beside them, and smiling every time he confirmed it. Before heading back inside, Walter stopped in front of Daniel and studied him for a long moment, as if reaching for some memory buried somewhere in the fog. "I don't remember when we met," he finally said. Daniel felt something tighten in his throat. "It doesn't matter." Walter smiled with the same open innocence he always carried. "But I know your family." Those words meant more to Daniel than any recognition he'd ever received across his entire career. That evening, once the visit had ended and Samantha had already driven off, Daniel lingered in the garden a little longer than usual. Eleanor sat beside him on the bench, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the trees. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "Something I should have told you the very first day we met." Daniel turned to face her. There was a different kind of nervousness in her now, one he hadn't seen before. Not the fear of losing her brother, but something older, something she'd been carrying far longer. "When I first saw you outside this building," Eleanor said, "it wasn't luck that brought me to that bench. I'd been reading about you in the papers for months. Your name, your face. I recognized it the second I saw your photograph in a business article last spring." Daniel frowned slightly, unsure where this was heading. "I don't understand." Eleanor reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, worn photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. She held it out to him with trembling hands. It showed a young woman, no older than 19, standing outside a hospital in Ohio, holding a newborn wrapped in a pale blue blanket. 52 years ago," she said. "I gave birth to a son in Columbus. I was 19, alone, scared, and pressured by my own family to give him up. I didn't have a choice the way people have choices today. I signed the papers 3 days after he was born, and I never held him again." Daniel's chest went tight. He stared at the photograph, then back at her face, searching for something he couldn't yet name. "His name when he was born was Samuel," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "I gave him that name in the hour before they took him from me. It's the only thing I was ever allowed to choose." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. He knew, distantly, abstractly, that he had been adopted as an infant. His parents had told him as much when he was a teenager, though they'd never shared many details, and he'd never pushed for them. He'd built an entire life without ever really asking the question. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "what are you telling me?" Tears were falling freely down her face now. "I'm telling you that the day I asked you to pretend to be my son wasn't really a lie at all. I just didn't have the courage to tell you the truth yet. I've watched you from a distance for years, Daniel. I've read every article, watched every interview, kept every clipping I could find. I told myself I'd never have the right to walk up and claim any part of your life. I only wanted to see you just once, before I ran out of time. And when I finally worked up the nerve to approach you, all I could manage was asking you to pretend, because pretending felt safer than the truth." Daniel sat frozen, the photograph trembling slightly in his own hands now. 52 years old, and a piece of his life he'd never questioned had just cracked wide open. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he finally managed. "Because I was terrified," Eleanor said. "Terrified you'd hate me for giving you up. Terrified that after everything you've already done for Walter and me, you'd feel like the past few weeks had been built on a lie. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you the very same week I finally found you." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, feeling something enormous and complicated moving through his chest. Grief, confusion, and underneath all of it, something that felt strangely like relief. He thought about every quiet moment over the past 2 weeks, the ease he'd felt sitting beside her, the way her voice had settled something in him he hadn't even realized was unsettled. "You didn't lie to me," he said finally, his voice rough. "You just hadn't told me the rest of it yet." Eleanor searched his face, afraid to hope. "You're not angry?" Daniel reached out and took her hand, the same way she had taken Walter's so many times. "I spent years thinking I didn't have anyone left to come home to. And it turns out I've had a mother searching for the courage to introduce herself for longer than I knew." Eleanor broke down completely then, and Daniel pulled her into an embrace that neither of them had known, until that exact moment, how badly they'd both needed. "Who was my father?" Daniel finally asked, once she'd steadied enough to speak again. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "His name was Thomas. He was a few years older than me, worked construction outside of Columbus. He wanted to keep you. He actually did, but my family wouldn't hear of it. And by the time I was old enough to stand up to them, the papers were already signed. He passed away almost 20 years ago now. Heart trouble. I only found out because I still read the local paper from back home out of habit." Daniel sat with that for a moment, turning the photograph over in his hands, studying a face that was somehow both a stranger's and unmistakably his own. "I should have looked for you," he said quietly. "All those years I never even tried." "You were a child," Eleanor said. "None of this was ever yours to carry. I was the one who let you go. I don't need you to apologize for growing up without me. I need you to know I never once stopped thinking about you, not for a single year." 2 days later, at Samantha's quiet suggestion, Daniel and Eleanor sat together in a small clinic across town, and each gave a simple cheek swab, more for Daniel's own peace of mind than out of any real doubt. When the results came back 8 days after that, Samantha delivered them in person, setting a single sheet of paper on Daniel's desk without a word. He read it twice before he trusted himself to speak. 99.9% probability of a maternal relationship. He carried that piece of paper folded in his jacket pocket for weeks afterward, taking it out sometimes late at night, just to look at it, the way other men might carry a photograph of someone they'd lost. Word of what Daniel had done for Eleanor and Walter eventually made its way to a local reporter named Jake Bennett, who covered human interest stories for the Portland Ledger and had a reputation for finding the quiet, overlooked stories buried underneath bigger headlines. He requested an interview through Daniel's office twice before Priya finally convinced Daniel it might be worth doing, if only to make sure the story about Willowbrook got told accurately rather than second-hand. They sat in the same garden where it had all started, Jake with a small recorder on the bench between them and a notepad he barely glanced at. "Most people in your position would have handed this off to a foundation, written a check, and moved on," Jake said. "You didn't do that. You showed up here almost every day for weeks. Why?" Daniel looked out toward the maple tree where Walter liked to feed the sparrows. "Because checks don't sit with someone when they're scared at 3 in the afternoon because they can't remember what year it is. Money can pay for care. It can't sit in a chair and hold someone's hand. And the woman at the center of all this, Eleanor Doyle, what is she to you?" Daniel paused for a moment longer than the question seemed to require. "She's someone who taught me something about staying, at a point in my life when I'd mostly forgotten how." That's a generous answer for someone you'd only just met. "Sometimes the people who teach us the most are the ones we've known the shortest amount of time," Daniel said, and left it there. When the piece ran the following week, it spread quickly online, shared and reshared far beyond the city limits, picked up eventually by a national outlet that ran it under the headline, "The Developer Who Chose to Stay." Comment sections filled with strangers sharing their own stories of aging parents, siblings separated by circumstance, promises kept and broken. When another reporter later asked Daniel why he'd gone to such lengths, he answered with a calm that surprised even himself. "Because no one should reach the end of their life feeling alone," he said. "And because family doesn't only come from blood, sometimes it's born the moment someone decides to stay, when everyone else has already walked away." He never mentioned in that interview the part of the story that belonged only to him and Eleanor. Some things, he decided, were theirs to keep. That November, for the first time in 6 years, Daniel hosted Thanksgiving. He had a van arranged to bring Eleanor and Walter across town, along with one of the Willowbrook aides who had grown close to them both, and he spent an entire Sunday afternoon relearning badly how to make his mother Susan's old stuffing recipe from a card he found in a box he hadn't opened since her funeral. Walter spent most of the dinner fascinated by the view of the river from Daniel's dining room windows, asking twice where they were and being told, patiently, both times. Eleanor sat at the head of the table across from her son, watching him carve a turkey he'd clearly never carved before, and laughed harder than Daniel had heard anyone laugh in his house in years. "Your father would have liked this," she said quietly near the end of the meal, and for once the word didn't catch in her throat the way it usually did. Not the house. The house he'd have found ridiculous, but this, all of us at one table. Daniel reached over and covered her hand with his. "Next year we'll do it here again, all of us." From the window of her shared room at Willowbrook, Eleanor watched Daniel cross the garden the way he now did almost every day. Walter, holding that same old plaid scarf, looked up and waved. Daniel waved back and smiled. There were no more promises left to make that afternoon. None were needed anymore. All three of them understood that for as long as they had time left to walk through that garden together, none of them would ever have to feel forgotten again. Sometimes the most important stories aren't about grand achievements at all, but about small, quiet decisions that end up changing an entire life. Daniel's choice to stay beside Eleanor and Walter didn't erase the pain of the past, hers or his own, but it proved that there's always a chance to repair what time seemed to have broken beyond fixing. Personally, every time I come across a story like this one, I'm reminded that the moments we treasure most later in life are rarely our achievements or our bank balances. They're the people who chose to stay exactly when we needed them most. If this story moved you in any way, I'd love to ask you something. What would you have done in Daniel's place? If you think this story is worth sharing, drop a 1 in the comments. And if you feel there's something that could have been done differently, or you'd like to add your own thoughts, leave a 0 instead. I read every comment because so often the best lessons come from people who've walked a much longer road through life than the rest of us. Maybe the biggest lesson in this whole story is that kindness given without expecting anything back has the power to completely change the course of someone's life. Every one of us deserves to feel loved, to have a place we can call home, and to hear our name spoken with real affection. Money, status, and success can make life more comfortable, but they will never replace the warmth of family, even when that family is chosen rather than given by blood. Sometimes all it takes is one person reaching out a hand for us to remember we're still capable of giving hope back to someone else. There's an old thought that stayed with me for a long time. Just as a single lit lamp in a window can guide a traveler safely through the dark, one small act of kindness can light the way for someone who thought they had nothing left to hope for. Maybe that's the real fortune we leave behind when our time finally comes. This story is a work of fiction, adapted and inspired by emotions, situations, and human values that many people recognize from their own lives. Beyond the details of the plot, its purpose is to invite reflection and to remind us that it's never too late to rebuild a connection, offer someone a second chance, or become the family someone else desperately needs. Take a few minutes today to think about the people who've shaped your life, and about anyone you might still have time to reach out to with a phone call, a visit, or one honest, simple gesture. And if this story found its way into your heart, it would mean a great deal if you subscribe to this channel, so we can keep sharing stories that remind us that compassion, hope, and love remain the greatest legacy any of us can leave behind.